for a really long time, our narrative was, Saiga, they're going extinct. Please help. And now we're in a situation where that narrative has utterly changed. Saiga is not going extinct. It's not doing as well as we would like in some parts, but in other areas it's doing well. And the challenges that we need to address are entirely new to those that we've been working on for the last 20 years.
Welcome to Saving Wildlife with me, Sam Williams. This is where we get to hear from amazing conservationists about their life and work and all the incredible things they do to save wildlife. Peter, you lead the Saiga Conservation Alliance, and that's a fascinating animal, and I'm intrigued to learn more about those. But you yourself have bounced around all over the world. Tell us about your path to where you are now.
I guess my path to where I am now starts very typically and then perhaps diverges from the path that lots of people take in conservation. And it started very typically in that I did the zoology undergraduate degree that's very common within our field. But then following that, that's where things started to get a little bit different from me. I always had this dream that I would be the next Attenborough, and I wanted to make nature films, and I wanted to travel the world, and I wanted to see all these spectacular wildlife encounters and incredible behaviors and just get deep into natural history filmmaking. And I tried to start my own production company and was wildly unsuccessful. And it was a great shock to me that when I wrote to the BBC letting them know that I'd finished my undergraduate degree and I was ready to become the next Attenborough, that they responded by letting me know that they already had an Attenborough and he was going to keep going for another 20 odd years.
Way longer than we expected.
Yeah.
Fantastic that he has.
Yeah. So I spent a year wondering what to do next, really. And then the first in a series of sort of serendipitous events came about in that I wrote to EJ, Professor EJ Milner-Gulland, who started the Saiga Conservation Alliance. I wrote to her because at the time she was running a master's course, Imperial College London, and asking speculatively about the following year what I might need to do to be considered an applicant who would be worthy of a place in the course. And I got an email back within an hour saying, if you can start in 2 weeks, you can come this year. I've had someone drop out. So I very hastily pulled together what few little funds I had and set off and jumped into the world of conservation science. Right. And that's what kick-started my career as a conservationist rather than as a zoologist / proto-natural history filmmaker.
So were you always interested in animals as a kid? Yeah, it was a
growing up in
passion.
Yeah, growing up in rural Cornwall with parents who are, I wouldn't say my parents are super nature focused, but I have a deep appreciation of the natural world.
Yeah.
So my dad spent a lot of his childhood interested in birds, but not as a birder. My mum is an artist, so I had a lot of my upbringing was very nature focused and in lots of beautiful wild parts of the world.
Cornwall is a beautiful spot to grow up, and I imagine you weekends and holidays were off having adventures. I can imagine it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of time spent at the beach, rock pooling, coastlines. And when I was very little, I had a couple of years when we were moving house, and I think it was probably quite a formative time reflecting on it, where my dad had taken a job. We lived originally in East Cornwall. My dad had taken a job in West Cornwall, and whilst we were looking to move, we ended up renting what was, to me, it felt like a little gamekeeper's cottage on a big sort of farm estate, like ancient slate floors, a well in the middle of the kitchen floor.
Really?
Yeah, my brother was a toddler at the time, so it wasn't perhaps the best. But it was right in the middle of nature, like a copse at the end of the garden, a beautiful little stream. And every day, a lovely old lady from the village used to come by with her dog, and every day I'd go for a walk with her dog. And she knew an awful lot about the local wildlife, local nature, and she was really good at introducing me to the joys of just spending time in your local environment. And we'd find abandoned baby hedgehogs and things like that. And there was all these sort of very tactile nature experiences, which I think when you're 6 are really important. They're sort of where you get the deep love of nature.
What a fantastic childhood to have that. I actually had a similar thing. I volunteered at a local zoo before volunteering, at least in my world, was even a thing. And it was, I think I was 12 when I started. And I was just going clean out parrot cages.
Yeah.
And I get to be around these amazing animals and I got to know them. But it's that same thing. It's very formative.
Yeah.
So from there you end up in the masters.
Yeah.
With EJ, and that's presumably you got exposure to Saiga there. But you on the course, but then you've gone all over since then.
Yeah. So after the masters, I did my master's thesis on environmental education. I was very interested in exactly what you've just been talking and asking me about, where people's love of nature and desire to conserve it comes from. And academically speaking, I was very interested in the values that people ascribe to nature and how those different values influence conservation behaviors. And from a higher level, I was very interested in how we can do more effective and efficient conservation work with the limited resources that we have available. And it appeared to me as a young conservationist that environmental education was often done as an afterthought. It was tacked on to a lot of conservation programs, and no one was really assessing whether it was having any of the impacts that it was being projected as having. So I was keen to actually do some quantitative analysis of how to do environmental education well and achieve the impacts you're trying to achieve through it.
Yeah, it is a bit challenging though, isn't it? It's not like just counting your animals.
No.
It's very difficult, and I think there's so much intangible with that. Like there's value that's so hard to tease apart that it becomes very difficult to measure.
It becomes difficult to measure, and you've got to be really upfront with your desire to undertake that study to check how effective you're going to be, because you're going to need to have some data from before your intervention is done to see how effective it's going to be. And then you're going to have to check during the intervention, after the intervention, and preferably at some further distance in time to check how behaviors stick and last. And finding a context where you can actually do that is quite challenging, because like I say, it's often tacked on to a conservation program as an afterthought, and I'll get some kids together, we'll give them a lecture in a theatre in school, and I'm sure it'll do some good in some way.
Yeah, definitely been there, done that.
Yeah.
But there's also the thing where I think often as biologists we look at a human population and see them all as the same, and it's just okay, we need to educate, we need to raise the level of education. But a sociologist, I'm not a sociologist, but I understand that a sociologist might look at a community and say, these are the key influences. And so they do interventions with those people, which then leads to the bigger thing. So that's another kind of challenge.
So that's what I tried to tease apart a little way in my master's thesis, was that we often aim environmental education at kids because they're very handy. They're corralled into an education space. There's a captive audience in a way. Yeah. And yet they're not the people who do the household decision making. They don't have the political agency. And so what I was trying to look at was how information taught to kids gets transferred to their parents and influences behavior at the household level. And that's changing knowledge and going a step further to actually changing behavior. And I looked at the differences in terms of changing what you might call a more sort of folk knowledge, where it was all based on fresh water sources, which are a scarce resource in small island states like the Seychelles, where I did the work.
Okay.
So more intrinsic folk knowledge based around where your local river might be, how well that type of information transits, compared to more specific conservation, water conservation behavior type knowledge, and how that transfers as well. And I stayed interested in environmental education for a while, but I wanted to try and push the theories about behavior change a bit further. And so I got quite interested in context of human-wildlife conflict. The idea, in my head at least, being if you could change the perceptions and behaviors towards a species which is initially perceived negatively, then your conservation intervention is going to be gold standard, really good. If you can start in a really bad place and take it to a really good place, then the strategies you're doing to achieve that change are spot on and should work for most contexts, trying to find things that are transferable and locally adaptable. So after the masters, I went to Latin America and did some work in Chile on sort of very small wildcat species called the huina, which lives in Patagonia. Very beautiful species, and started a very long history of me not seeing the species I was studying.
That's like Rocio, who we both know, who's worked with Andean cats. for 22 years, I think, and may have seen one once.
Yeah.
It's astonishing. That's the thing with the cats. They're obviously not lions, but these small cats, I can't imagine working with a species you never see.
Yeah, from wanting to be doing nature films and having all these amazing sort of experiences, seeing spectacular behaviors up close, I then went about 8 years without seeing my study species. Any of them. Any of them.
Brilliant.
That's partly my fault for choosing the wrong species, perhaps.
But in the Seychelles island species, presumably there was an abundance of cool species that you saw there. Although you were working with rivers and water,
yeah,
you must have seen some
cool
cool stuff.
Yeah, so I think through the masters, I accidentally became a social scientist, and people became my real species of study. But within me, I retained that love of nature, and there was a vessel to get me to the species and the landscapes I wanted to be in and not be seeing, but at least be in the presence of.
So you've gone from Seychelles, bounced over to
Chile,
Latin America. Then where next?
After Chile, I came back to the UK, and that's when I moved up here to Cambridge. There was, as I said to you before, it was a little after the global financial crisis. Work was very hard to come by, but it seemed like Cambridge and the conservation community here existed in this little bubble. Lots of my friends from my master's degree had moved up here, and so I moved up, and within a week I had a house, a bike, and 4 jobs, and was paying off all that time I'd spent in Latin America, and settled into working at BirdLife for about 6 months until I got a Skype call, which is how we used to do it back in the day, from EJ, who had run the master's course and supervised my master's thesis, saying, A, have you published your master's thesis paper yet? And B, do you want to go to Uzbekistan in 2 weeks' time and do some research for me on similar themes, effectiveness and efficiency of outreach initiatives? But my first exposure to doing work linked to Saiga.
Right, yeah. And so Uzbekistan, draw me a postcard of Uzbekistan.
So
how would I picture it?
This is the nice thing about Saiga, is they mostly exist in parts of the world that people don't know much about, really. If you mention Kazakhstan to people, the first thing they tend to think is
Borat.
Much to the chagrin of everyone in Kazakhstan. But it's a spectacular and fascinating part of the world with an incredible history. I really enjoy reading deeply into the sort of history of the Silk Road.
Yeah.
And more generally, I'm very interested in transitions and graduations, either through time or space. And Central Asia is a fantastic blend of West and East, and seeing that sort of graduation, that change in culture, the historical emphases that you feel echoing through history. I find it a really fascinating part of the world to be in. Uzbekistan itself is very diverse and changing rapidly. So you have snow leopards in the mountainous bits, you have deserts, you have the Aral Sea disaster, you have a little bit of everything going on.
The Aral Sea is the largest body that dried up, is that right?
Yeah, so it was the world's 3rd largest lake, and during Soviet times, certain rivers were rerouted for agriculture, particularly for cotton production. And you have this incredible ecological disaster, the echoes of which are still being felt to this day. And people might have seen incredible images of rusting, vast Soviet-era fishing boats that are now tens of kilometers from the edge of the water. And it's a really interesting statement in terms of how people can very rapidly flip an ecosystem from one state to another. One of the things that did happen that we've been working on, Saiga Conservation Alliance, is what used to be an island, we're calling it Resurrection Island, which was the site of a Soviet biological testing site, became joined to the mainland, and that's where we've been focusing a lot of our restoration efforts in the north of Uzbekistan. It's been fascinating to see this place that was once a site for biological weapons testing become a site for biological restoration activity. It's a spectacular part of the world, that sort of edge. You spent much time in deserts, for example?
Not really.
Yeah, so deserts, Me neither. It's not an environment that ever really appealed to me as a young child. It was all, I want to go to rainforests, I want to go to coral reefs. But you spend time in the desert or you spend time in the steppe, and it has this way of getting under your skin. And there's something ephemeral and hard to describe about it. Vast open spaces.
And that's what I picture. I picture rolling grasslands
Yeah.
and just vast expanses.
Sometimes not even rolling.
Oh, really?
Just pancake flat for
Oh,
as far
really?
as it. In some ways, if you're out in the steppe in central Kazakhstan, it can feel like being at sea.
Okay.
So the grass is moving in the way that waves might, and you and your little Land Cruiser feeling like you're adrift in this vast ocean of grassland. And again, you get this sort of graduations, this sort of slow and gentle change in the flora that you're driving over. And then very small landscape features become absolute magnets for wildlife because it's a change, it's a niche.
Yeah.
I was there start of the summer, and there was a little remnant forest that had been planted during Soviet times just on the edge of a community that we drove past. And the entire forest was just full of red-footed falcons and merlins, because it was like one of the few places they could find to breed and nest, not on the ground in the landscape. And nature's looking for these sort of little differences within the landscape, and I find that really an interesting way to be within a landscape, spotting how wildlife interact with the landscape they're in.
Fascinating. So that was your first experience going out there, doing some research work, and then you've moved from that to now leading the organization. Is there a few steps along the way, or is it logical?
Yeah, no, not logical in the slightest.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much a bounce around scenario. So I went to Uzbekistan for the first time to look at the effectiveness of a couple of outreach initiatives which were being run as ways, one of which was an education program, linking very much to the work I'd been doing previously. And others were more linked to providing alternative livelihoods for people in that area of northern Uzbekistan. Is a challenging place to live, particularly in the post-Soviet environment. So when the state was providing lots of the support, and there was collective farming and the likes, and the gas pipelines were present, there was employment and life was more stable in the sort of post-Soviet economic turmoil that Central Asia suffered. It became very challenging being there. We're talking about an area about the size of Wales that might have about 5 settlements in it.
Wow.
And whilst I was there in the summer, it was 48 degrees C every single day.
Wow.
And same environment in winter, it might be minus 35 or minus 40. So we're talking about a place which has nearly a 90-degree temperature shift between summer and winter. I'm sure there's a couple of days in April where it's absolutely lovely. But 25 degrees, absolutely perfect. But the rest of the time, it's quite an extreme environment in many ways. Dry, freezing cold. It's got a challenging place to be. And in a way, that sort of economic turmoil around the collapse of the USSR, what led to the spectacular population declines in Saiga, which led to the species being listed as critically endangered, led to all the conservation work, and led to this alternative livelihood schemes that I was there to assess. Essentially trying to find different ways of putting money into people's pockets so that they didn't feel like their only choice was to poach saiga for their horns, which were desirable in the traditional Chinese medicine trade.
So you've had a long connection to the project. And during that time, there's been these massive population fluctuations.
Yeah.
I really want to know about those. But as we're talking about saiga, let's introduce the saiga.
Okay.
Because when I think about antelope, I think of like beautiful, elegant species. And saiga don't really fit that mold. I was kind of thinking, well, they must have great personalities. Describe a saiga for someone who's only listening to audio.
About goat size, I would say. Goat to large goat size. So perhaps slightly smaller than you might expect. Have you seen the picture?
Yeah, I was expecting.
The males have horns. The females do not. And the horns are lightly spiraled as they go up. But the main feature, the thing that everyone goes towards, is they have this nasal structure, which is unique amongst antelopes, let's put it that way. Yeah. It looks perhaps slightly like a small trunk, and it's what gives them that look. Lots of people say that they look like something a bit out of Star Wars, or they have a look I mean, they are an Ice Age relic. They have
that's
that
right.
sort of
They
Ice Age Pleistocene look to them.
And is there an ecological function to this structure?
Yeah, it's, as far as I understand, it's an appendage with multiple uses. So we talked about it being really cold in winter. So the ability to warm air before it goes into the body is really useful. And in summer, a lot of dust in the environment, the ability to filter out dust might be another really useful feature of the nose.
Interesting. But it's not really an olfactory thing where they're detecting other herds at tens of kilometers away or anything like that.
No, historically, they would have been going around in such massive herds anyway, during the sort of time when they all come together for their breeding congregations, that, yeah, no need to be going off and finding Saiga elsewhere because you're already in amongst tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them. Yeah.
I'm really surprised by the size. I just assumed they were cow size or something.
Yeah, no.
Interesting.
Small but fast. That's the other thing. Yeah, really rapid.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they'll run at about 60 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
Forever, basically.
Do they have natural predators? Is there some cats there or something?
Historically, it would have been cheetahs before they were extirpated from the landscape.
Wow.
We're in discussions with various people now talking about the potential to reintroduce cheetahs in the landscape, and you can imagine what a good wildlife documentary that would make.
Yeah.
I'll go out and make it. Cheetahs chasing Saiga, that would be a real speed chase, because Saiga can keep it up for a long time. Cheetahs got that burst of acceleration. Wolves tend to hang around the edges of the aggregations, picking off the sick and the weak and the newborns. But yeah, I'm interested in the potential for the future.
Part of the whole rewilding thing that we're moving towards.
Yeah.
Over the time you've been involved over history as well, the Saiga have gone on these massive population cycles.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not sure how things line up, but they initially, the thing that led to the Saiga Conservation Alliance was the first decline there was about poaching. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So that economic turmoil in Central Asia caused by the collapse of the USSR also coincided with the removal of all those sort of state top-down pressures, organization that you got from that sort of Soviet system. Borders were open for the first time, and with the horns being valuable in traditional Chinese medicine, it became possible for the first time for poaching for males to occur, the horns then to be traded internationally. And with a paucity of other employment opportunities, people needed to put food on the table.
Sure.
And as a result, the males were poached to such an extreme level that there simply weren't enough males left to fertilize the females in these birthing aggregations they come to. And so you had 95 to 98% population decline in less than a decade. And the numbers, literally the graph's hilarious. It just falls off a cliff and just goes like this. And so the SCA was started in response to the need to address this catastrophic decline and basically to stop the species going extinct, which is what would have happened, and in a very short space of time.
So the population decline has been driven by poaching of males.
Yeah.
How did they recover from that? Is that hands-on management of the animals or moving males around?
So one of the features of Saiga biology is that because they live in these quite hostile environments, they need to migrate very large distances to be able to find good forage. They are naturally a boom and bust species.
Right.
So their populations in the wild do naturally go through cycles. A particularly harsh winter could wipe out a lot. They're together in big aggregations. A disease can come through and wipe out a lot. So they have a huge innate capacity to increase their numbers themselves. The females will give birth at about 11 months and will then twin every year after that. So if the conditions are right, the population can recover very rapidly.
For a mammal, that's pretty impressive.
It's wild, absolutely wild. So what needed to happen to allow the Saiga to recover was to remove the anthropogenic pressure.
Sure.
And let the Saiga get on with it in a way. Those anthropogenic pressures, like you say, initially was poaching. But then as Central Asia starts to find its feet, starts to develop, new pressures start to come in, border fences, pipelines, any type of linear infrastructure,
Sure.
really bad for a terrestrial migratory species that needs to be able to travel very large distances between its summer and winter areas. You put a train line with fencing through that, it becomes a significant issue.
How far are we talking? Have you done any tracking?
There has been tracking. The tracking has been used to see where that sort of annual cycle of migration is and to look at the impact of different infrastructure types. There are 5, maybe now 6 populations of Saiga across Central Asia.
Okay.
So the other big challenge that you have is they're not all in one place. And the countries that they are in are not necessarily, at least when we were getting started, working well together. So this is where we get into the meat of what the SCA is and what the SCA does.
Let's hold that. I want to keep going on the biology because I want to understand them. It's so different to the animals that I've worked with where, when I cut my teeth in conservation, I was working with Mauritius kestrels, which were 4 birds at one time. And it's like hands-on management of the individuals.
Yeah.
Whereas this is such a very different situation. The 5 or so populations, are they essentially islands? Is there any natural?
They're essentially islands.
Okay.
So we have a population in Russia, a population in West Kazakhstan that is somewhat transboundary into Russia, a population in the south of Kazakhstan, which is transboundary into Uzbekistan, a population that's entirely within Kazakhstan, and a subpopulation, a subspecies, a population of a subspecies of Saiga, which is entirely within Mongolia.
For those on audio, we've got a map, or we'll put a map on the YouTube. I think we've got to add a map there.
Yeah, definitely, because it's not a part of the world that's particularly known.
Yeah.
To ask people to draw the countries of Central Asia, a lot of head scratching.
I would struggle. Yeah. Okay, so they're spread out over these multiple countries. And so when we're talking about these population cycles, are they happening independent of each other, or is it actually like all 5 or so populations are having challenges in the same moment?
It can be quite different for different populations. So following the big population decline from poaching, that sort of first decade of the SCA was all about removing that poaching pressure or finding ways for governments to work together, working with local people, working in the communities, removing intense poaching pressure, finding ways to avoid that activity taking place. Law enforcement, border control. You can imagine the type of activities. And numbers started to increase to a certain extent. And then 2015, 2016, a disease came through. The 2 populations which have recovered best in Kazakhstan, and in the space of 3 weeks, I think about 66% of the individuals in those 2 populations died.
It's astonishing. I remember that happening and being shocked by the news. I talked with Frank Pope with Save the Elephants and how they lost 100,000 elephants over 3 years. But this is like more than half the population in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
That must have been traumatic for anyone involved.
I think for those people going out into the field, having to bury the bodies and things like that, it must have been harrowing. It must have been harrowing. I had just finished my second project with the SCA at that time, and so I wasn't working on Saiga when it happened. I was away from the front lines of it. But I remember seeing the pictures coming through, and it was quite a kick in the teeth because you really stride for a decade, starting to see a little bit of progress. Slow, it's hard work. You know what it's like, starting anything, building relationships, incremental changes, step by step, each one hard fought for, really a real piece of work. You're just starting to feel like you're getting somewhere, and then boom, you're right back to where you started again after 10 years of hard slog.
So do we have an estimate of how many were left at that point? Kind of how low did the population go?
I think it was probably in the regions, lowest points, we're talking about sort of 30,000, 40,000 individuals.
Which isn't many on the scale they range.
Considering before the first population crash, the poaching crash, there would have been a million or so.
So we've got the low. I don't know what happened between then and now, or if it's just linear, but now the population is doing incredibly well.
Yes and no.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Like all
Right,
things in
okay.
conservation, it's a shade of grey rather than black and white. There are a couple of populations in Kazakhstan which have done incredibly well. And we can get into the sort of how this has been achieved, but the baseline figures are that there are now a lot more Saiga than there were before the first population crash. Precise figures become difficult when the challenges of counting that many individuals over that much space requires a lot of time in aeroplanes. We were exploring AI and satellite
I was
image
just
ways of
thinking
counting.
that. Yeah.
Because things have to change. It's too expensive, it's too complicated. But there's in the order of 3 million at
Wow.
least in Kazakhstan alone. And yet in Uzbekistan, there's 500.
Oh, wow.
So it's not like we're up everywhere. It's a heterogeneous picture of recovery.
So is there an opportunity for translocations, or does that not really make any sense?
I think there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't really make one sense. Saiga don't travel well.
Okay.
And Saiga travel incredibly well under their own steam.
Yes, I see that, yeah.
They don't travel well in vehicles.
Yes.
I think that's probably a better way to put it. The sensible way to do it is to reconnect the populations where that's feasible and let them get on with it. Let the natural migrations be re-established. You're fighting climate change, you're fighting linear infrastructure. There's a lot of big challenges to doing that, but it's the sustainable way of doing it. You let the Saiga get on with being Saiga. Let them go where they need to go. You have these vast open spaces. They know where they need to be to find the forage, to find the shelter from whatever extreme temperature is that day.
Yeah.
They know where they need to be. We just got to let them be in that space. And then you're talking landscape scale conservation. That's hard.
That's what strikes me with this, is the scale of it. And when you talked about driving around to count them. Flying around. Oh, there's the Land Cruiser was earlier. So how do you do that work? You're always dependent on air transport to move around, because even if you're doing outreach you've got days of driving presumably between communities or something. I mean, what's that look like operationally?
So this is, again, comes into sort of the way in which SCA works, which is that unlike a lot of conservation organizations which are species focused, we don't do much work on the ground.
Okay.
The whole sort of mandate and the idea behind the Saiga Conservation Alliance is that it is an alliance of organizations. It's not the SCA coming in and counting Saiga. It's not the SCA coming in and doing a study on disease or whatever it might be. We exist to help coordinate and facilitate the existence of an alliance of organizations who collaboratively come together to work on conserving Saiga. And that's necessary because of the number of different species, number of different countries where Saiga are found, the scales that you're working at, and the breadth of the issues which impact them. It's the size of the organization you would need to be able to tackle all of those things individually is not feasible. And a lot of it is done so much better by having a local organization in Kazakhstan who does the counting, does the outreach, does the monitoring, does the political lobbying, whatever it around infrastructure, whatever it might be that needs to be done. It's much better if that's managed in-house, in country, rather than somebody flying over, parachuting in, struggling with the language and making a bit of a hash of it. We're much better at that sort of umbrella situation, facilitating, exchanging knowledge, building that effectiveness and that efficiency, which I talked about being one of my early drivers from doing conservation. And talking about the scale, we've only really touched on half of the picture. We've talked about the countries where Saiga live, but we haven't talked about the other half of the equation, which is the countries where Saiga are consumed. Because you're not only working in the range states, you need to be working in the consumption states as well. So then you can add China, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam to the equation as well, and others. And suddenly you're looking at a picture which is most of Asia.
You're dealing with a tremendous range of cultures, languages, and just ways of doing things. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. You're exactly right. The languages alone is a big challenge. So the SCA as an organization has 6 operating languages.
Wow.
So when we put out our biannual newsletter, our summary, our roundup of everything that's happening in the world of Saiga, it goes out in 6 languages so that it's directly accessible to everyone on the ground doing work who needs to know. If you're in China and you're working with pharmaceutical producers or doctors who are prescribing traditional Chinese medicine products,
Right.
you need to know what the Kazakh government is thinking about in terms of its efforts to lobby to have international horn trade re-established, for example. And if all that's being produced in Kazakh or Russian, it's not much good to you if you speak Mandarin.
Yeah.
And so having that sort of coordinated global picture of Saiga conservation is one of the things that the SCA tries to provide.
Right. That is a challenge I can't imagine, not being good at language. So, yeah.
Also awful. It's one of my major failings as a human being.
just strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
that way.
No.
Can you go into a bit more about the work that you're doing in the consumer countries?
So I think best way to approach this, going back in time to the second piece of work I did with the SCA, which was much more in that sort of coordination space, trying to strengthen ways for the alliance to come together, different organizations and individuals, not just within conservation organizations, but within national governments, within UN bodies like the Convention for Migratory Species and CITES, for all of those people to have a space where information can be shared, learnt from, arguments can be had, beers can be drunk. That's sort of everything that makes collaborative conservation work. That's what I came into for the second piece of work that I did with Saiga. But there has always been a big challenge with engaging consumer states to the same extent we've been able to engage with range states. By the time that I was doing that second piece of work, there was some really good collaborative work between range states. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan were really starting to gel together, talk together. Russia was an active partner at that time. Mongolians were really on board, sharing, learning from others. It was the range states were really there in the room. If you were having Central Asian Mammals Initiative pre-COP, whatever it might be, actually getting consumption states to attend and engage in the way that you really wanted was always one of the big challenges we faced. And I think that leads nicely into the sort of the third piece of work that I did for the SCA, which was after quite an extended break from working on Saiga. So I finished that second piece of work 2014, 2015. And it wasn't until 2022 that I came back in any meaningful way. Again, phone call from EJ. And a really interesting piece of work was about to begin, or it had just begun, which was a whole portfolio of projects, all funded by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, all on Saiga trade. But the really interesting thing for me is that there was really good levels of engagement with the consumer states, active partners in China, in Malaysia, in Japan, and Singapore, who were going to have their own projects within this overarching portfolio. And the SCA had a standalone project within the portfolio, which was not doing work on the ground, but was that sort of facilitation role, not creating space for knowledge exchange, the joined up thinking, making the cumulative outputs of the portfolio greater than the sum of the individual parts, if you like. I find that a really lovely way to work. It builds on that efficiency and effectiveness that I really like in conservation. We are still cash strapped for the size of the task we're trying to do. So if every dollar can be spent and maximize its impact, then that gets me going. I'm all for that. Yeah. So I came back into Saiga work for that reason, because I saw a really strong potential to really leverage a nice opportunity to do an awful lot of good at what was a really interesting time for Saiga. Numbers were starting to really grow at that point. They've subsequently exploded, as we said, in Kazakhstan. And so that's what lured me back into the world of Saiga.
That's interesting. I was thinking about the population cycle thing, because now you're engaged and leading the organization, and it seems like you've joined at a time where there is this population recovery, but given that it's cyclical, then do you anticipate there's going to be a population crash again? Is there a number of years that you expect that to happen, or is it just, it can happen 10 years time? Or
I think this is the great challenge for us as an organization right now. For a really long time, our narrative was, Saiga, they're going extinct. Please help. And now we're in a situation where that narrative has utterly changed. Saiga is not going extinct. It's not doing as well as we would like in some parts, but in other areas it's doing well. And the challenges that we need to address are entirely new to those that we've been working on for the last 20 and have skills to do it. Yeah. We're now in West Kazakhstan dealing with human-wildlife conflict, as local people are rightfully worried about Saiga stamping all over their hay meadows and eating all their crops. We know how intractable human-wildlife conflict can become if it's not addressed urgently. The Kazakh government has been having culls of Saiga to reduce the population as one of the ways of addressing this conflict scenario. And as of a month ago, there was, at the CITES COP, the Kazakh government successfully put in an amendment to the Saiga listing on CITES to re-establish a legal international wildlife trade in horns. So we now have legal rather than illegal trade to be working on. Climate change is starting to bite in Central Asia in a big way. It's going to be one of the areas that's really badly affected outside the polar regions.
In what way is it affected? Is there an idea of where it's going to go? Or?
Aridification is going to be one of the main issues. Water already scarce within the landscape. Grasslands turning into semi-desert, turning into desert.
When you talked about 48 degrees Celsius, is that normal, or is that already a bit higher than it used to be? Or is it going to go higher?
Someone did show me something recently that was suggesting that in the West Kazakh landscape, where we have one of the populations that's done very well, temperatures could be expected to change by as much as 2 degrees in the next decade or two. So it's a really rapidly changing environment there.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of these sort of new and emergent challenges. At the same time, the whole narrative of Saiga conservation has changed. So when we're dealing with funders or with donors, our narrative is now much more complex and much more subtle and much more nuanced. And learning how to tell that story is a big challenge for us.
And for people to grasp that, you need there to be 3 million or 4 million, because they're going to crash again in the future.
If the disease comes through again, and 88% go from some of the big populations in the space of 3 weeks, you're back where you were.
You're back to critically endangered within 3 weeks.
Yeah, or you're certainly back to not a great space.
Yes.
Fortunately, some of those anthropogenic pressures that were really driving them low have been dealt with and lifted, and they should be able to rebound and reestablish. But if you combine disease with legal trade that's not done well, combined with is when these sort of compounding of new issues. This is the bit that worries me, is things look quite rosy from the outside, but it could be a very short space of time before they're not rosy again. And how do we keep that interest in the species?
And how can you adapt the policies, which are slow moving things? If you suddenly have a population crash and there's still legal trade in horn, then that's really problematic, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
So how is the Saiga Conservation Alliance adapting to that? And what are you putting in? Are you working on preparations for that kind of thing? And where do you go from here?
I think the key activity is to keep working closely with all those partners that we've built up over the years. So this year, when we went to the CITES COP for this sort of critical vote on Saiga, I found the whole experience incredibly positive because I don't know, you've
I've not been to
a society, Scott?
No, I haven't been to a
There's a lot of arguing about comma placements.
Yeah, best way to spend
Yeah,
your time.
yeah. But there's also an awful lot of sort of legal movement that can happen quite rapidly. And the vote on Saiga was, I would say, the least contentious and the most well received of anything that happened on COP. And that was entirely because the Kazakh government, alongside a lot of its NGO partners, had spent an awful lot of time and energy and effort doing everything right. They were really applauded by all the other parties, by the Secretariat themselves, for just doing it right. They really made the effort to put in place all the safeguards, to do the necessary horn tagging, to do the work on stockpiles, to set up monitoring, to do a trade or start a trial trade in a way that was carefully monitored, easily could be rolled back and adapted.
Okay.
And the receptiveness of the government to advice has been really pleasing to see. We had a side event there that looked at evidence gaps in the Saiga supply chain, and the Kazakh government were there in abundance, hung around afterwards, were very interested to meet trade economists that we were able to introduce them from economic contacts. It's being done in the right way. This is
It sounds
really,
like fantastic.
it's
success.
really positive.
Yeah.
But this is a success that's built on 20 years of relationship building.
Yes. Yeah.
My concern is that if you start to say everything's okay, we can take our foot off the gas, the moment things do start to go wrong, you're then rebuilding on those. You don't want to be starting from zero again, because it takes so long to build yourself into a space where you can do things really well.
Yeah. And also, we talk about collaborations between organizations, but there's still individuals within those organizations. Yeah. And so you're maintaining personal relationships and trust between people and respect. And that makes me think about the challenge as the leader of the organization of having a narrative now of needing to maintain that stuff in anticipation of future challenges.
Yeah.
How has this boom and bust affected your funding from institutional versus donor or individual donors and things? How's that all fit together?
From the donor perspective, this is quite a new world for me. It's only since taking over the organization last January, nearly a year ago, in fact, very close to a year ago next week, that I've had exposure to that. I've done a very good job of hiding from fundraising in the past. I like to go in, do some nice, interesting research, and then
project-based,
disappear before any real reporting needs to happen. That's the dream scenario, right? But actually, I found engaging with the donor community through WCN to be one of my highlights this year. I've really enjoyed it. I found it really rewarding. I found it very interesting. I've learned an awful lot in a short space of time. But you're right, it's a challenge now. Typically, historically, donations have been up when things have been going bad.
There's the urgency, right?
There's an urgency. So we saw our best ever year for donations when there was that mass disease die-off. The problem from the donor perspective is that narrative. How do we tell that narrative of there's so much good we can do with this network and alliance that's been built in terms of landscape scale conservation that benefits not just Saiga, but so many species across Central Asia, given the scale of the environment if it works for Saiga, you're bringing an awful lot of good in with you. How do we tell that story and keep donors engaged when there are so many conservation contexts for them?
That is interesting because the scale of the impact is larger, but you go from the one species to the ecosystem, which isn't typically as sexy.
No, goodness me, no. Saiga have never been one of the sexy, cute and cuddlies that attract a huge amount. And Central Asia isn't East Africa in terms of, from a non-conservationist professional perspective, it's not going to be up there with lions, elephants, the classics. Monochromatic species, somebody said to me the other day. Snow leopards, zebras. Monochromatic tends to do well.
I like to say that with the parrots, we bring colour because you can paint all the other with a few colours. Monochromatic, I like.
Yeah. But scale and building on a legacy of success and a hard-won functional relationship is one of the narratives we'll try to explore with the donor community and see who can who we can engage there. Historically, because of the way the SCA was founded and who was involved with it, we've tended to lean more on programmatic funds, either for academic work, which provides the evidence base, which we then use to help inform all our partner organizations' work, and which they use to help build their prioritizations of what they're going to be doing. Or in the case of Uzbekistan, where we do things more directly on the ground, having programs like I talked about Resurrection Island, for example, looking to re-establish Saiga habitat in that area, setting up new national parks, whole variety environmental education programs, outreach initiatives, a whole variety of stuff that we do.
One of the success stories is the formation of a national park. There was the SCA was involved in, is it just one or is it?
There was a national park existing already, but you'll know just because something's drawn on the map doesn't mean it's necessarily functioning as a national park.
Yeah.
So whilst it's nice to be able to say in a report, we founded a new national park, it's also as important to turn something that exists as a national park into a functioning conservation space. I'm as proud of that type of work as I am of putting entirely new lines on a map.
There's subtleties there, isn't there, which does make the communication of that to funders, that nuance there between, okay, you can create a national park, which is one thing, but actually making it functional, that it takes a sophisticated donor to grasp that.
Yeah.
It's not, so that it seems like you've got challenges in continuing the work to protect the area that are different to the kind of just the biological challenge of we've only got 10 left or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly.
How does that impact your communications? Do you have to think very clearly about how do you share these stories with your donors?
Good question.
Glad there's one.
Yeah, good question. And the honest answer is this is something I'm very much still learning about.
Right.
Really, this is very new to me. Like all of my historic conservation work has been very much me as an individual, plowing my own furrow, going where the wind takes me or seizing opportunity. And so to come in and not only work for an organization for an extended period, but actually to be responsible and run things and have to deal with fundraising and communications and things like that. I'm still learning, taking baby steps. I feel like WCN Expo this year was a very steep learning curve for me, and got some good feedback about some things I'd done well, but also WCN are providing me with a lot of insights and support in terms of how to tell these complicated stories and how to pitch them and who to pitch them to. Yeah. And it's important for us at the moment. I had perhaps written off the donor community as how important they were before, because
for us it's huge.
Yeah,
more than 60%.
Because we'd relied historically so much on the project-based funding.
Yeah, but how has that recent changes that must have affected your funding landscape?
Massively. Yeah, massively. So I took over running the organization on the 10th of January. And on the 28th of January, when the US federal funding cuts came in and the stop work orders started coming through by email, we lost 70% of our projected funding for the next 3 years.
Wow.
In the space of a day. And as someone who'd taken over the organization, having said, I don't really like doing admin and can we avoid too much fundraising? I just want to get on with making a new strategy and a new direction for the organization. This first year has been very admin heavy.
Yeah.
But it's been good as well. And it made me realize how important the donor community is there as that safety net. Like without WCN, this might well have been the last year for the SCA.
It's interesting, you talk about the traditional route in, or at least sort of biology related degree, which many of us do because we're into the animals or fascinated by the animals. And then this whole different skill set. And what intrigues me is not only are you as the leader having to learn the art of communications and donor engagement and donor stewardship, but you're doing that with a changing narrative and sort of, I think,
and a rapidly changing conservation context on top of that. Like the sand is moving underneath us, and then where we're trying to go to is change. It's all in flux. It's
Yes.
all mobile. And so trying to say, look, this is an organization that was started 20 years ago when internet access in Central Asia was not really a thing. And Saiga were very scarce. Organizations weren't necessarily talking to each other well, or the capacity was really low. And that whole context has completely changed. And we as an organization need to reassess exactly where we sit, how we add value, what our continued role is, whilst the conservation context is rapidly evolving around us.
Yeah.
And the whole funding landscape has been utterly exploded this year. So it's a case of trying to hit a moving target with a dart and trying to land the bullseye.
It's a fascinating mix of different things. It's almost like a problem that we rarely one of those problems is one that we rarely have, where there's a conservation success. Yeah. And for many, if it's just a pure species focused organization, it's almost linear. And then you're in the business of making things common, yeah, and then you do yourself out of a job. Yeah. But anticipating the future cycles of the population of Saiga, you can expect that you're never going to be quite out of a job, because you're waiting for the next crash.
You're waiting for the next crash. And also, I didn't take over running the SCA because I love Saiga. There are a lot of people who do a species managed project and they do it because that is their species. That is their bag. They absolutely love that species. You're macaws.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
You love them. That's your thing, right?
It's changing, but yeah.
Yeah. Saiga were never my thing. I like them. They're great. They're a really cool species. But I'd be just as happy working on little poison dart frogs. I'd be just as happy going back and doing snow leopard stuff. I'd be just as happy doing marine stuff. I work on Saiga because I see an opportunity to have a massive impact in a part of the world that's overlooked. Like, I'm all about efficiency and effectiveness. Like, it goes back to those initial things that I got into environmental education for. Is there's a potential here by putting your fingers on the scale in just the right place to have a really big effect in terms of tipping the balance towards a place where you want to be.
Yeah.
And I think with Saiga, we're in that position where a well-placed thumb on the scales, if we can nail down that communications in our place with the network, with the alliance that has been hard won, and building from a position of strength with all that body of proof behind us, and then we've got more than 3 million individuals proving that we can make it work. If we can build from that position of strength, then the scale of the landscape where Saiga exist, the number of different conservation linked subjects which feed into their population maintenance, we can be providing a really solid conservation impact across a massive portion of the world by utilizing this sort of unique position in this place in time. So that's why I ultimately, at the second time of asking, when I took over running the organization, because I thought, hang on, actually, if we get this right now, then there's the opportunity to do something really special, which will have a really long-term impact. It becomes more than just avoiding extinction. It becomes not surviving, but it becomes thriving. And I think that's just continues that trajectory of positivity.
It's really interesting. I wonder for you, how has it been going from wanting to be wildlife documentary filmmaker to now this very different work with way more people focused?
Yeah.
Was there a moment where you realized, that's happening? Or was it something through the research that you did that you then sought it out?
I think the major transition happened during my master's degree, where I became aware that there was a real risk of just counting certain species into extinction. I would love to spend the next 3 years on a Colombian cloud forest stream counting frogs. Like, that would be great. How much fun would that be? It'd be absolutely fantastic, right? But it wouldn't necessarily help those frogs. Each year you go back, there'd be a few less, and there'd be a few less. And then one year you go to count them and there'd be none left. And I really like nature. I really like biodiversity. I want my kids to grow up and get to experience some of the spectacular landscapes and species that I've been fortunate enough to see along the way. Not my study species, obviously, but those ones that exist in that landscape. And I try to help achieving that biodiversity conservation by working where you can put your thumb on the scales, where you can achieve impact. And ultimately, if people are causing the problems, then people are the ones you've got to work with to make the solutions. You can't ignore them. They're everywhere.
Yeah, that's it. So are you able to imagine what this all looks like in 10 years' time? Or it's just, there's so many moving parts, but do you have an idea of what you'd like to see?
Yeah, I do. I should also point out that we are currently doing a horizon scan of upcoming threats to Saiga with a 10-year timeline. EJ and I have a master's student at Oxford who's, came with us to CITES COP. She's utilising this alliance, this broad base of knowledge to really tap into that and get people's perspectives. And I hope we'll have a really nice understanding of what we should be focusing on in terms of threats coming down the line.
That's dreamy in terms of strategic planning.
Exactly.
That's fantastic.
But in terms of a vision,
I want one.
Yeah. You've got to get some really good master's student first. There's loads at Oxford. In terms of a vision, the vision for the SCA has always been, you can flash it up on the screen if you want, but it's about getting Saiga back in the landscape, fulfilling their sort of functional role within this ecosystem, but also their cultural role within the landscape. And that's a part that we don't want to overlook. The steppes of Central Asia are not devoid of people. They are there. They're not there in the densities that we might be used to in Europe or North America, but they are there, and they're, as they are everywhere, an essential part of the landscape. And that relationship between Saiga and people and steppe and environment is one that's, I think, increasingly going to be the focus of the organization in some way, particularly as Saiga numbers increase and the conflicts there. We need to address the conflict. We need to make sure that trade is done in a managed, careful, thoughtful way. Can't say no, can't stop it. It's going to happen. We just got to be there doing it in the best possible way and ensuring where we can that the money that's generated is fed back into conservation, maybe addressing the conflict. If local people can get benefits from having Saiga present, that's a really way of helping to mitigate those negative perceptions that come from having to soak up the economic cost of having Saiga around. For me, it's all about having a better connected steppe environment in which Saiga flourish and people are flourishing too. So, bringing everything up together. Where we go in the consumption states, it's very hard to predict. Countries like China are changing so fast. Tastes, exposures. It's quite new for me, a lot of this sort of area. And so it's hard to say, this is what I want. I don't want to be colonial and go in there and say, I don't want anyone using any animal products in East Asia. A, it's not going to happen. And B, who am I to say that's how you should behave? What I want is for people to be thoughtful and considerate. And I want people to look at details and nuance. And I want people doing all of those things collaboratively so that together, collectively, Saiga remain and thrive and that people do well in the landscape too.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think that is, going back to the postcard and the rolling hills, I'm imagining it in large herds of Saiga. It's just a really nice thing to think of. And I think I very much like the idea of moving beyond just the one species, but it's almost like the flagship thing where it's then the whole ecosystem
comes along.
And there's got to be massive carbon stores there and all that kind of stuff. There's so many compelling reasons to protect it.
Yeah.
And I think that the work you're doing, the successes actually need more exposure, because it is amazing that the scale at which your organization has worked. And I just I think we'll obviously link to socials and things so people can find you.
Yep.
Just want to say thanks for chatting, and really inspiring to talk and learn about this amazing work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for thinking of me, giving me this chance to talk a little bit. There's so many things that can be touched on. I encourage everyone to do a deeper dive into Saiga. And if you are conservation interested, then come and get involved in conservation in Central Asia. There's a bajillion things to be done and so much opportunity to do it. And governments and organizations are on board. So come and be part of something positive.